Hey, it's Clay. Welcome to another League of Legends video. This time I wanted to do an update. Previously I did an 80 carry tier list. I believe that was on patch 3.14, but I wanted to update it. Let's go ahead and see if we can find that video. Let's see, right here. Yep, my 3.14 marksman tier list. And I've got a lot of requests from a lot of guys asking to do more tier lists. And the most requested one has definitely been mid lane, and so I wanted to go ahead and do that now. So as you can see, my presentation is not the best, but this is what I've got to work with right now, so this is how it's going to be. But I kind of, basically what I did was I pulled all of the relevant champions that I believe are commonly played in mid lane. Certainly there are other possibilities, but more of the niche or like less popular ones I did not even include. So I guess you can kind of take that where what you may. But I kind of just put them all on a list, and then basically how I go about doing this is all from my personal opinions on these champions. I'm not taking in any sort of like objective data about win rates or pick rates or ban rates or any of that kind of stuff. I'm just talking about my personal thoughts on these champions and how they fit. Now, this isn't just from me playing them. Like, certainly, so for example, like Ziggs, I actually have not had the most success personally on Ziggs, but I still think he's really strong, and that's coming from, watching the LCS, the stuff that we saw at Battle of the Atlantic, and also just, when I play games, if I'm playing on 80 carry, there are two mid laners in that game, and I think, you can see how well they're doing, and you can kind of get a basis for how strong those champions are, just because you're seeing them a lot. So that's kind of one thing, and so yeah, this is definitely basically very much my personal thoughts and opinions on these champions, so not an objective-based list whatsoever, mostly just my thoughts. But anyways, let's go ahead and dive into it. Let's start with my top tier. This is my top tier right here. I've got Kassadin, Ziggs, Orianna, Gragas, and Syndra. Now, basically, Kassadin is broken right now. He's slated for nerfs or like a rework in patch 3.16, which I think is well-deserved. He is just too powerful for what he can do. He's probably the most mobile champion in the game with the way that his ultimate works. Every 5 or 6 seconds or so, he can blink anywhere he wants, and it just makes him almost impossible to deal with and slow down. And he's one of those champions where he's got this very poor laning phase, but once he hits level 6, the map suddenly becomes his playground, and he can roam and just kill people, and it's way too easy to play Kassadin's mid game. It's way too hard to play against him. So he's just broken right now, and I think a lot of people would agree with that. So anyways, next is Ziggs. Ziggs has really shot up to popularity. He slowly received buff after buff patches ago at the end of Season 3, and now he's in this place where he's the best kind of, he's just got so much going for him. He's got great wave clear, he's got great poke, he has fantastic sieging, he can take towers really well with his passive. He also has really good zone control between his Q and his W and his E and even his ultimate. He can kind of take an ownership over an area and basically say, if you want to enter into an area and fight us, you're gonna die. And so he's just very powerful. He has very few counters. He's got a good escape and disengage. He just has a lot of things going for him, and he's just a very powerful mage right now. Orianna is probably one of the safest champions in the game. Somebody who you can pick, if you've got first pick and you've got to pick a mid laner, Orianna is probably one of the best champions to pick. She can do well against almost anyone. She lanes well. She can even do well against assassins. She doesn't really have any counters. And her team fight control is also really good, especially if you have some good hard engage. You can get some good ultimates off if you are confident with that. She can be very strong throughout all stages of the game. Just a very strong, safe, solid champion with little downside, I would say. Gragas is another very strong champ. Again, he's got good laning. One of the thing about him is that he's melee, and so he has really good base stats. And also his W really helps him out with that as well. So, he's got damage reduction. He's got good amounts of attack damage. On top of that, he's got supremely high AP ratios on his Q and his ultimate. His E gives him some really nice mobility. And his E was changed, so it is nerfed if you're trying to run away, but it's actually been buffed if you're using it aggressively to deal damage. And so I think Gragas is definitely in a strong spot. Again, somebody who doesn't really have any counters, and is just a very strong, safe pick. Next up is Syndra. Syndra is probably the perfect combination of damage and utility. She's got very high damage. All 4 of her spells deal a lot of damage. They all have very high base damage. She can assassinate people with a Deathfire Grasp. But then she also has some really nice utility, which I think is kind of underrated on her. She's got a nice AoE knockback / stun on her E. She's got a slow on her W. And if you pick up something like Rylai's, you can get slows on your Q as well. And so just a very versatile, again, very strong laner, very, very strong lane bully that can really deal very easily. Again, very few counters. She is a little bit immobile, which is kind of one of her weaknesses, but she's just got so much other upsides that I definitely think she's got a spot in the top. She is a little bit harder to play out of all these. I think she's probably the most difficult to play well consistently. So take that into consideration if you're not very comfortable with skill shots or positioning. Syndra's probably not for you, but I can't deny her power right now. So that's my top tier. Now, when I look at the rest of these champions, one of the reasons why I kind of put them here is because I think these are kind of the top tier, and you kind of have to compare all the other champions to these. So it's like, if you're looking at Xerath, well, how does Xerath do against these champions? And then you kind of go from there. So keep that in mind as to why I'm putting these champions where I am. So anyways, this next group, I'm going to kind of start generalizing a little bit. So we have a couple of assassins in here in Kha'Zix, Talon, and Fizz. I kind of think that they're the strongest assassins at the moment. Fizz, his nerf to his W didn't really hurt him all that much. And then Talon and Kha'Zix was kind of a situation where, because some of these other assassins, Zed, Ahri, and then I guess Cass didn't really get nerfed, but specifically Zed and Ahri, because they got nerfed, these other 3-ish assassins are suddenly in a little bit of a better spot. So that's kind of why I've got them here. I still think they're strong, but they're not as good. The big thing right now, I think, is that there's so many tanks running around between the top lane hyper tank meta with Mundo and Shyvana and Nasus, and then with the bottom lane, you're getting a lot of very tanky supports as well, and then you're often getting, at least off tanks coming out of the jungle. It's just a difficult environment to live in when, you're so squishy and you've got to blow up a target, and it makes it a little tough for these guys, so I can't really put them in the top tier. After that, we have a bunch of different mages. So, I actually want to talk a little about Kayle. I think Kayle is in a very strong place. She's actually, especially with the tank meta, she can actually do really, really well against tanks. She can kite them with her Q. Her passive gives her some shred, and her E is just it's just a very, very good constant. Her damage is very constant. She has. It's not like a lot of these other champions have burst, but burst is really bad against tanks. Against tanks, you need consistent DPS, and so Kayle works really well. On top of that, she's got great utility with her ult, which can be game-changing. So I think Kayle's in a very strong place right now, personally. The only reason I don't have her up here is because she doesn't do quite as well against long-range mages, which, talking about like Syndra, Gragas, Orianna, Ziggs, a lot of them are very long-range, so they can poke her fairly effectively, but I still think Kayle is in a strong place. We've got other poke mages like Lux, Nidalee, let's see here, you could even put maybe Karma in there, Xerath, Zyra, these are more long-range mages. Basically, they are strong, but they don't quite measure up to these guys. They just don't quite have the same level of power as some of these top-tier champions, so I can't really put them up there. Like, if you look at Lux, she doesn't have quite the mobility of Ziggs. Nidalee, she's more basically just a one-trick pony with her spears, and she did receive some nerfs. It just is kind of a situation where they're strong, but not quite as strong in comparison. Let's see. We also have some really heavy burst mages like Annie. She's in there. Swain and Malzahar are kind of interesting choices right now. Morgana. These are kind of forgotten champions who I actually think are a little bit under the radar, but still very strong. Swain specifically, he can be really tanky and do a lot of damage. And he's got a lot of sustain, so I actually think he's got a lot of upside. Malzahar has a very consistently high win rate, so does Morgana. So definitely good champions to consider. I still think that these champions are pretty strong and definitely very viable, just maybe not as elite as some of these other top-tier champions. Next, I grouped this group together of assassins, I think, and actually I think I forgot about Akali. I'm going to put her in here as well. So this is these are assassins who have received nerfs, is kind of what I'm going to say. So if you look at Diana, she got nerfed a while back on her shield. Ahri got nerfed. Actually, Katarina did get a buff, but she, like a long time ago, got cut down a little bit. Zed got nerfed. Akali got nerfed. And, I think they're just a little bit sub-tier compared to these other assassins that are up here. And also, especially like I said before, with these guys, the tank meta is definitely making it difficult for assassins to really flourish. So I just don't think that they're in the best of places. They each kind of have their own niches. Diana is a little more of a bruiser who has really good, hard engage with her suction or vacuum ability, whatever it's called. I think it's on her W or E, maybe. I'm not exactly sure. Ahri got hit with, she's a lot more skill dependent now. You need to land your charm to have success. Katarina is probably the best team fight assassin because her ability to clean up and just snowball team fights is through the roof. But her laning is absolutely abysmal. Zed, I actually think Zed is still pretty strong. It's just that, the changes to his shadows on his W and his R, it made it harder to instantly burst someone without retaliation, because now there's a little bit more time and your opponents can react, and so especially with all these tanks running around, it makes it a little more difficult to really flourish as Zed. LeBlanc is an interesting champ. She's really somebody who can cause a lot of havoc around the map, especially if she gets a couple early kills. Her single target burst is immense. Once she gets DFG, she can 100-0 just about any squishy champ, and that's a really useful thing to have. But her wave clear isn't very good, and her late game tends to struggle because she doesn't have, in these chaotic 5v5 team fights, she doesn't tend to do as well as somebody like Zed or Katarina. She just kind of gets lost in the shuffle, and people say that her damage falls off. Well, it's not necessarily that her damage is falling off. It's that she just doesn't have the space to function like she did before, and kind of like the skirmish abilities. And then Akali, again, very poor laning pre-6. But then if you think about, compare Akali to Kassadin. Kassadin is just kind of better in every way, to be completely honest. His ultimate is better. Akali's maybe does more damage, but it can only be used on opponents, whereas Kassadin can go anywhere. Yeah, I wouldn't see any reason to play Akali when you could play Kassadin. Is kind of why I have her lower. So next, this is a group of mages that I didn't feel fit in this group because each of them has a drawback, I would say. Cassiopeia, she's really high skill ceiling. She's a little bit more short-ranged. Kind of a tough champion to play really well. Really relies on landing your... I said Syndra has a high skill cap, and that's true, but I think Cassiopeia has even a higher skill cap. Just a hard champion to play, and doesn't really work that great in solo queue, I guess. But I kind of like her. I think she's a fun champion to play, but it's one of those things where if you miss a Q and get out of position, you're just going to die. It's just too difficult to position properly and land all your skill shots and, follow your poison. She's just a touch too difficult to play. Lissandra, her big thing is she's just very short range. If she wants to get in and fully utilize her Q and her W, she has to be, really in the mix. So, and that works really, really well in, the LCS, where you've got great coordination, and you can all, wombo combo. She's great with hard engage. She's got a ton of crowd control and engage potential, but in solo queue, that tends to not work so well. I've played a lot of games on Lissandra where, I'm going to go in and I'm going to, throw my burst on this one target, and then all of a sudden my team was like, actually, we don't really want to follow you in, and then I just die. And so I don't think she really works that well in solo queue. There are certain champions that prey on the solo queue mentality, and there are other champions that fall victim to it, and I think Lissandra is in that latter category. Heimerdinger is kind of an interesting place. I haven't actually seen him too much since his rework. He's just kind of too much of a niche champion. His whole turret mechanic is just a little bit different, and I've always thought that with Heimerdinger, especially, I think mobility is the biggest thing that gets Heimerdinger down, because Heimerdinger is all about saying this area is really strong. It's almost like when he puts down his turrets, it's like having a real turret anywhere you want. But if the enemy team decides not to fight there, then your turrets don't do anything. So it's hard to really set up your den and nest of control. I'm sure that with experienced Heimerdinger players that I don't know. I just don't know enough about him to really put him in this higher category because I think he's a little bit too niche. Victor is kind of a weird champion. I actually have never played him myself, and I don't really see him that often, so I didn't really know what to do. I think his mechanics are just a little bit too weird. His laser is kind of strange, and he doesn't have any mobility, but he does have some good damage, good burst. His item thing is kind of weird too. Like only getting 5 items is kind of strange. So he's just kind of a weird champion. So I guess that's all I'm gonna say about Victor. And then the rest of these guys, I shouldn't go too in depth, but it's just one of those instances where, again, when you compare them to some of these other champions, like compare Ziggs to Anivia. Ziggs has better mobility. He has an escape. He has just as much wave clear with lower mana costs. He doesn't need to itemize for as much mana as she does. Mordekaiser and Vladimir kind of in this weird place. I just don't think that these champions can really stand up to some of these higher ones. They just have a drawback. And then these picks are kind of, I think they're in a bit of a bad place, is I guess what I'm going to say. And some of them are a little bit more niche, like Elise and Galio and Sion are kind of niche picks that can work really well in a very specific situation. Elise with her percent damage, Galio with his great against a double A P comp, he can work really well. Sion he's Sion. But definitely not champions that you could rely on reliably. Veigar I think he's just a little bit weak. He can't really trade, because you want to be using your Q to stack up your AP, but then that leaves you with no reliable way to actually trade damage with your opponent, and it's relatively short range, so he just tends to really struggle in lane, and it just takes him a while. Once he gets his DFG and stacks some ability power, he can do really well, but it's hard to really get him to farm very safely. Twisted Fate just isn't in the best place right now, and what he brings to the table isn't really valued in the current meta. The current meta is more about sieging and poking. If you look at a lot of these mages, a lot of them, especially these guys right here, and a lot of some of these, they're really good at sieging and poking. And Twisted Fate is all about map control and kind of creating skirmish opportunities that are really good for your team. And so some of the global champions like Shen, Karthus, Twisted Fate, these guys don't have the same sort of impact in the game as they did before, just because they simply aren't as valued in the current meta. Jace got hit with the nerf bat a little too hard, and the big thing with Jace was not just that his gate was increased in cooldown, but also that the tier was nerfed. The tier stacking is a lot slower now, so that delays Jace's power spike. I still think he can work as like a poke mid laner, so that's why I put him in here, but I don't think he's the best choice. Cho'Gath, I really liked Cho'Gath as a mid lane pick to counter assassins. Was really one of the reasons why I really liked Cho'Gath before. But now you're not seeing as many assassins, and so you're gonna get especially compare Cho'Gath if you're up against one of these champions. You're just gonna have a rough time really having a lot of success, and you don't bring as much to the table as they do. If you're Cho'Gath, if you go mid, do you build AP? Do you build tanky? If you build tanky, your team's not going to have enough damage, but Cho'Gath doesn't have he can't put out as much damage reliably. His cooldowns are too high compared to some of these other champions, so just don't think he's as strong. Teemo, I think he's better top lane against bruisers, melee champions. He has short range. He doesn't really have any way to kind of deal with some of these longer ranged mages, but his mushrooms are still really powerful. So in a late game scenario, if you get mushroom around Baron, you can really have a lot of map control that way, which I think is very underrated. But in good conscience, I simply can't put Teemo higher. I thought about putting Ryze up in this category, and I think that there is maybe an argument that could be. But I don't know. I don't know what to think about Ryze. His win rate has been consistently low. But at the same time, games are going longer, and that tends to help hyper scaling champions like Ryze. And also if you go 9-21 or something like that, or even 0-21-9 tends to be pretty good on Ryze, because there's a lot of really good defensive masteries now, and he's tankier, so he can use them pretty well. And so I don't know exactly what to think Ryze. You could potentially put him up higher, but his range is just too short for him to really deal with some of these long-range poking champions very well. I don't know. I don't really know what to think about Ryze. I kind of need to dwell on that a little bit more just to understand how much his nerfs hit him. And then last on the list, I have Yasuo. Now, I still think that Yasuo, even though he's been out for a little while, I don't necessarily think that the seen has really figured him out yet. He's kind of in a weird place. I think mid lane is his strongest lane, but, you know, he's just kind of a weird champion. His ranges are really short. He's extremely dependent on getting the knock-up, and whether you're getting that from your team or from your third proc of your Q, either one of those situations is actually very unreliable and kind of difficult to use optimally. You know, I don't know how many times I've played Yasuo and I've thought, man, this would be a great time to use my ult, but you just can't. You know, and a lot of times I ended up just using my ultimate whenever I got a knock-up, whether or not it was the optimal time. You know, and it's just kind of one of those things where his kit, again, doesn't really work that well in solo queue. You know, squishy melee carries tend to not do very well against, you know, these big tanks. Yeah, just not so sure on him yet. But anyways, that's going to be my tier list. Again, focusing on these guys, I think, are the really strong picks right now. And you can also dip into here as well. And then when you get down in this area, I think it's a little bit more situational. You know, if you're really confident and comfortable in these champions, definitely continue to play them. But they're more situational picks. And then these guys, I think, need a little bit of help. So that's kind of my overarching mid-lane tier list. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Feel free to rate and subscribe for more videos like this. And be sure to tell me what tier list you want to see next. And I'll see you again soon. Bye.